Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. My name is Eric Black and today I'm coming at you with another reed review. Today I am reviewing the D'Addario Reserve B-flat clarinet reed lineup. That includes the Reserve Classic, and the Reserve Evolution, their latest offering. First, I want to quickly say that D'Addario has not sponsored this video in any way. However, I would like to give a huge thank you to North Country Winds for providing these reeds for this video. If you don't know who they are, I'll leave a link in the description of this video and put it on the screen now, but North Country Winds is a clarinet specialist shop. You can buy reeds, ligatures, all sorts of accessories, instruments. If it's related to the clarinet, you can get it there, and they also specialize in clarinet repair. So if you don't know them, go check them out. So for those of you who have seen my other clarinet reed reviews, you basically know how this is going to go. I broke in a full box of each of these reeds using my normal break-in process. I then selected one representative reed from each box to do a couple of excerpts on. I play these excerpts back to back. The first will be the Brahms second clarinet sonata, the first movement, just a little portion from that. And then I'll do a little portion from Mendelssohn's A Midsummer Night's Dream, the scherzo movement. My clarinet equipment and audio setup remain constant, with only the reeds being changed. I'll put what I'm playing on exactly in the description of this video, and I'll also post my audio equipment there as well. All the recordings were made within the same hour to reduce the chances of the reeds changing, or for my breathing, sound production to change if I were to record on separate days. After you listen to all the excerpts, I will give you my breakdown and general review of all the reeds. So with that being said, let's get right into the Brahms. Oh, I should note, for best results, it's really a good idea to use some kind of headphones or a dedicated speaker system to really be able to hear the subtle differences between these reeds. If you're listening on an iPhone speaker, there's a lot you're going to miss. Alrighty, those are the reeds. Before we go any further, as always, if you could go ahead right now and post in the comments which reed you like the best, which reed you like the least, and maybe why, that would be super helpful. In the following sections, I will be giving my opinions on how the reeds sounded, how they responded, how they articulated, and ultimately how they broke in, and I don't want to sway your opinion just yet. So it's always really interesting for me to be able to hear what you all thought before I have given my opinion and kind of swayed you one way or the other. But to start with, we'll be talking about how these reeds sounded. Alright, so I don't believe it's any big secret that D'Addario has crafted their lineup to directly compete with some of the more popular reeds that Vandoren sells. To start with, we've got the Reserve, which is their version of the Vandoren Traditional. Like the Traditional, it features rounded tip corners, a standard size vamp, a French file, and it's also the thinnest reed in the lineup. Then you have the D'Addario Reserve Classic. The Reserve Classic is their version of the Vandoren V12. For that, you have a slightly longer vamp. You've got squared, kind of broader tip corners. You also have the French file, and then it is thicker than the standard Reserve cut. So it's a thick blank reed, much like the V12. Finally, you have the D'Addario Evolution. I'm going to be honest, I'm not sure this has any direct correlation to Vandoren's lineup. I think it's supposed to target a similar audience to people who like the Ruler Peak 56. However, the reed designs are considerably different. While they are both the thickest reeds in their respective lineups, the D'Addario is much less tapered in its profile. If you look at the D'Addario and the 56 side by side, you will notice that the 56 tapers much more from the tip to the base of the reed. They both notably lack French files and are about the same thickness. Their tip shapes are also considerably different. Without getting too much into redesign, I do want to point a few things out. So some of you may be surprised to learn that the thicker a reed is actually means the softer it's naturally going to be. I know that doesn't make a lot of sense. It's a little counterintuitive, but I'll explain. So the reed material that's underneath the bark is hardest closest to the bark. So the farther away you get from the reed's bark, the softer the material is naturally going to be. That's why on reed charts, the Reserve or like a Vandoren Traditional are generally a quarter to sometimes even a half strength stronger than their more thickly cut counterparts like the V12 or the Reserve Classic. Now that brings us to the Evolution, which is the thickest cut reed in this lineup. So even though the cane is going to be a little softer the thicker cut the reed is, you're still adding more mass to the reed. So to get it to vibrate in a way that we all want it to vibrate, material needs to be generally still removed somewhere. So with the 56, Vandoren achieves that not only by changing the profile of the reed, the actual reed cut, but also the taper of the reed, how it shapes from tip to the bottom end of the reed. Now the Evolution doesn't have much of this taper. It's relatively straight. So that makes me think that D'Addario has completely reworked the reed's profile to add in a little more vibrancy that they're not getting from the shape of the reed. And therefore it's probably a considerably different reed, and considerably different design choices were made, that it's not really comparable to a 56, even though I imagine they're both trying to achieve a darker, more round, mellow sound. But let's get back to sound. So the Reserve has a really focused sound. Maybe it's a little more compact, a little smaller, but despite that, I still think it would carry very well in most orchestral settings, while still maintaining a nice cover. It wouldn't be too bright. The Reserve Classic has a nice, broad, colorful sound. It maintains a nice roundness throughout the whole range of the instrument. It carries a nice color, and there seems to be more flexibility in the sounds produced and the colors produced with this reed than with the standard reserve. The Evolution sounds very round, if a little diffuse at times. I imagine someone trying to achieve a darker, more covered sound, this would be their choice from this particular lineup. So when I was playing these reeds behind the instrument, I actually thought these reeds felt and sounded a little more vibrant than their Vandoren counterparts. However, I pulled up my Vandoren video and I played the excerpts one after the other, going traditional to reserve, V12 to reserve classic, and then kind of 56 through the Evolution. And to my ear, across the board, the reserves actually sound a little more subdued than their Vandoren cousins. However, that could just be my playing. Like maybe I was just blowing a little harder or using a little more air or voicing things a little differently on the day I recorded the Vandoren video. So I'm not exactly sure it's a 100% fair statement to make. It was just something I observed. You can go check it out for yourself, see what you think, but just to my ear, tiny bit more subdued. But they still are all kind of in the same ballpark in terms of sound design. But anyway, behind the instrument, the Reserve Classic definitely had the sound I liked the most. However, when I went back and listened to the recordings, I think you can make a strong case for the Reserve also sounding just as good, if not better. So this one was kind of a toss-up for me. Alright, that brings us to response. Now, I'm going to be honest, how these reeds responded for me, I have mixed feelings about. And it's not necessarily for the reasons that you may think. In general, the Reserve played like a traditional. It was a little harder than I typically like on my Mouthpiece. However, the response was still pretty good, and I could certainly get it to do what I needed to do despite the extra resistance that I was feeling in the reed itself. Reserve Classic was my favorite reed response-wise. It responded immediately with a generally nice sound, very round. At times, it responded almost too well. The sound could jump out at you if you weren't careful, but that's nothing that a little, air manipulation or embouchure manipulation couldn't fix. The reed was more than manageable. The Evolution, however, was in general not a joy to play. I think it could be due to the fact that it's a thicker blank reed, and that Diodario's cane already feels a little bit spongy to me. But to get the reed to respond, the sound to focus, and the pitch to be in tune the way I need my reeds to be, I found myself using an increasing amount of embouchure pressure to get the reed to respond and sound just right. The problem was, due to the way the reed feels, it never felt like enough embouchure pressure was being applied, and that the sound was never quite getting where I wanted it to get. Obviously, the reed isn't designed to be played this way. No manufacturer goes to their design team and says, let's make a reed that is harder to play, that makes the clarinet players have to work for the sound. At least I hope not. This led me to thinking about what this reed was designed for, and it was designed concurrently with the Reserve Evolution Mouthpiece. I haven't played the Mouthpiece, but from what I've heard, there's a lot of hold in the sound, a lot more ping. It was designed to be perhaps a little more resonant in the Mouthpiece itself. You didn't have to go looking for a reed to find that resonance. So I was thinking, if they were going to design a reed to match that Mouthpiece, they may want to design a reed that can help balance out some of the resonance or vibrancy in the sound. So I think this reed would play better with a Mouthpiece that has a little more hold in it naturally, a little more focus in it naturally, and something that you don't generally have to use embouchure pressure to get the point back into the sound. So to test that, I slapped the same reed that I played on in the Brahms and Mendelssohn excerpts on my standard Mouthpiece on a Mouthpiece that I know has more hold and resonance and vibrancy in it naturally. And I'll play the result for you right now. I definitely found the reed much, much easier to play. I didn't have to fight or bite or use extra embouchure pressure to get it to respond the way I wanted it to. It balanced out the sound of this mouthpiece nicely, and it was a lot easier to get the reed to respond in ways I wanted it to. You can hear in that video that the reed is very responsive. The sound isn't nearly as tubby in the articulation as with on my old mouthpiece, and that I can also get a much bigger decrescendo in the ascending scale up to that high C at the end of that portion of the excerpt. Previously with my normal mouthpiece, that wasn't possible at all. Overall, to my taste, the Reserve Classic was my preferred reed here. However, it's clear that mouthpiece and mouthpiece design will have a huge impact on how these reeds will perform for you. And so that brings us to articulation. Now, articulation always ties in with response somewhat, but in this section, I'm more interested in how the articulation itself sounded and how easy it was to produce rapidly. The easiest reed, surprisingly for me to articulate on, was the Diodario Reserve. And I think that's because it had a little more back pressure. It was a little, harder to play on in general. So that extra back pressure made the individual notes, the individual articulations feel a little more solid. I could connect with them a little bit better. Listening to the sound was reasonably clear. I felt like you had a good separation between the notes. However, at times it felt a little heavy for something like the Mendelssohn Scherzo. I also didn't feel like I had a huge amount of control or flexibility in the dynamic range. The Reserve Classic was very easy to articulate on, almost too easy. At times I felt like my tongue was bouncing off the reed without getting like a clear articulation. In general, I thought the sound was very round without being tubby and reasonably light. I'm not sure you got quite as much note-to-note clarity as you did with the Reserve. However, I think the lightness makes up for that a little bit. However, between these two reeds, I feel like you're really splitting hairs. The Evolution, on the other hand, on my BD5 at least, feels and sounded a lot more subdued. I feel like the articulation does get into the kind of tubby, almost thuddy territory, due probably to the thicker tip I believe it has. Yeah, a thicker tip for enhanced articulation is what Diodario says. Like I said earlier, I felt like I didn't really have any control over the dynamics, and with the articulation, I was just sort of along for the ride. With my alternate mouthpiece, of course that all changed. The articulation was lighter, the sound was more clear, more clean, and it went back to sounding round without sounding too tubby. I also had a lot more dynamic control. Alright, so that brings us to the break-in portion of this video. So in my Vandoren video, I had these huge, elaborate charts that showed you exactly how each reed played on every day of the break-in process, how I would rate that reed on that individual day, and ultimately how many of the reeds in each box were quote-unquote good. I'm not doing that for this video. I'm not sure there's a lot to be gained that I can't just tell you by showing you one chart of ultimately how I felt each reed broke in and how many were usable from the box. I've also changed my numbering system. It goes from 1 star to 3 stars, with 3 stars being a reed that I would find usable in a performance scenario, whether it be like a lesson, an important rehearsal, or a real performance. 2 being practice reed, and a 1 being basically unusable for me. So I'm happy to report that the Reserve had 10 out of 10 reads, 3 stars. There was nothing in the box that I wouldn't feel comfortable playing in some kind of performance scenario. Then for the Reserve Classic, 9 out of 10 reads, were good enough that I would feel comfortable using them in some kind of performance scenario, with one reed being relegated to a practice reed. And then with the Evolution, 8 out of 10 reeds were usable in a performance scenario, with 2 out of 10 being relegated to practice reeds. So that means there were no 1 stars here. Every reed in the box, in each of these 3 boxes, was at least usable in some scenario for me personally. For all of these reeds, their break-in were pretty much identical. Out of the box, they were a little bit harder, the sound was a little more diffuse, but after my break-in process, they had lightened considerably and the sound was much more clear compared to what it previously had been as I first played on them. So ultimately, if I had to pick one of these reeds to play on my particular copy of the BD5 Mouthpiece, it would be the Reserve Classic. Not only was it the easiest to play on, but I also felt the sound in general was the most dynamic. It had the most range and flexibility and allowed me to more easily achieve the sound I hear when I imagine my playing in my head. This makes total sense to me, as the Reserve Classic's direct counterpart, the V12, is my favorite reed from the Vandoren lineup. The sound in the Reserve was also very, very nice. I did not end up choosing it because I didn't like the extra resistance that playing on the reed provided, and ultimately I didn't feel I had as much flexibility in the colors I could achieve with the sound or the dynamic range. If you are someone who in general likes Vandorens, the traditional or the V12 cut, but can't really ever seem to get more than a couple reeds to play out of the box, then I think it might be worth trying, either or both of the D'Addario Reserve and Reserve Classic reeds. I think they provide a similar playing experience and sound concept while being different enough that if the Vandorens don't work for you, that these might. The Evolution, again, just didn't work that well on my standard mouthpiece, so I won't be using it with that setup. In general, I think if you're playing on a BD5, a B40, anything with a larger kind of tip opening that's designed to be more mellow, then this reed probably isn't going to provide the sound that you're looking for. However, I'm sure there's plenty of people out there proving me wrong right now that play on this mouthpiece all the time with super dark, like Nomos B2 or Play Easy B2 mouthpieces, and are still achieving a beautiful sound. However, in general, I think if you play like an M13, M13 Lyre, some of the old Richard Hawkins like Zinner blanks that were really closed and focused, some Bane mouthpieces that are closed and have a lot of hold and like ping in the sound, then this reed might really pair nicely with those particular mouthpieces and help round out the sound, balance the sound a little bit more. This is just my opinion. I could be totally wrong, but I really think that's what this reed was designed to pair best with. As always, thank you so much for watching. I really, really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like, comment, and ultimately subscribe to the channel. Something like 95% of people who watch my videos aren't subscribed, so if you could go ahead and subscribe now, that really helps me out and allows me to continue making future projects like this. If you have any questions or general comments or even requests for future videos, let me know down in the comments below. Until next time, happy practicing.